59b, towards the bottom of the Mishnah. Starts off Pesach sheshachta shloi lishma, a paschal sacrifice that was shechted not for the sake of a paschal sacrifice of a Pesach, but shechted for, let's say, a shlamim. Now, if it's at the time that it's supposed to be shechted as a korban Pesach, I mean it's on the 14th, then that's a problem. If it's at a different time of the year, then that's different. That's acceptable. But here, it was a korban Pesach, and when it was being offered, the whoever was shechting it didn't have that intention, the proper intention that it's for a korban Pesach. Then it says, "V'kibel v'halach v'zorak shaloi l'shmai," and the blood was received, and the blood was walked to the altar, and it was sprinkled also shaloi l'shmai, for the wrong intention. Instead of a korban Pesach, it was the intention of a shlamim. Oy l'shmai v'shaloi l'shmai. Or it was for the right intention and for the wrong intention. In other words, the first intention was correct, the second intention was incorrect. First intention was a Pesach, the second intention was a shlamim. Oy shaloi l'shmai l'shmai, or the opposite. The first intention was a shlamim, and the second intention was a Pesach. Those cases are puzzle. Ketzad l'shmai v'shaloi l'shmai. What's a case of the correct intention and an incorrect intention? L'shem Pesach or l'shem shlamim. It was for a korban Pesach and for a korban shlamim, which means second was korban shlamim. L'shmai v'shaloi l'shmai v'l'shmai. What about for the wrong intention and then for the correct intention? That would be l'shem shlamim l'shem Pesach. The wrong intention first, that was l'shem shlamim, and then the second intention was l'shem Pesach. You have to put the comments in there, or else you read it. Boy of Papa. If Papa has a question. This question is based on a Gemara that we had earlier here, Daf Gimel, and we also had it in Tamura. There's a machlekes between Reb Meir and Reb Yosi. If someone says that this animal here should be in exchange for another sacrifice, so it's called Tamura. Now, if the person says that this animal should be exchanged for an oila and for a shlamim, yeah, so the rule of Tamura is that the animal takes on the status of the one that it's exchanged for, and they're both holy. The problem here is that he said two animals that it should be in place of. He said l'shem oila or l'shem shlamim. Tamura oila, tamura shlamim. Now, which one did he mean? Reb Meir says tafas lashon rishon. The first one was said first. He said the first one, and that's it. He's done. Reb Yosi says af b'lashon nachren adam nitvas, af b'gmar dvar adam nitvas. He meant both. So according to Reb Yosi, this animal needs to be get a mum and then exchanged for, it has both holinesses in it, and you have to buy two new animals, one an oila and the shlamim, because he said both. Reb Meir says you only accept the first statement. I guess you'll have to add. So comes along Rav Papa and asks a question. When our Mishnah said that there's two intentions, l'shmai and shalei l'shmai, we said it's possible. Are those two intentions at the same avodah, or are they in separate avodah? So what's going to be over here? According to Rabbi Yosi, a person is nitvas b'gmar dvarav. It doesn't matter if it's the same avodah, separate avodas. He said two things. Each one could invalidate the sacrifice. According to Reb Meir, there's going to be an issue here, because according to Reb Meir, if it's two different avodas, avodah means he had an intention by shchita one thing, and he had intention by the zrika or kabbalah and something else. If it's two separate avodas, then according to Reb Meir, well, the shchita was, let's say, correct, but the zrika was not correct. Okay, it's invalid. But if it's the same avodah, then Reb Meir would say, 1 second, that avodah had two machshavas. A person is only responsible for the first machshava. The second one doesn't count, according to Reb Meir. He stopped right after the first one. So why would it be invalid? Our Mishnah can't be Reb Meir. Reb Papa's question is our Mishnah two avodas, and the intention is by two separate things, and the Mishnah fits with Reb Meir? Or is our Mishnah referring to one avodah, you had both of the thoughts, and the Mishnah only fits with Reb Yossi? Is it referring to one avodah? Reb Yossi, and it's the opinion of Reb Yossi, that a person is, it's not responsible, but a person is held accountable for his second thought as well. The Reb Meir, because if you were Reb Meir, Reb Meir says that the person is only held accountable for his first thought, his first expression. Second expression doesn't count. It's already valid. We don't listen to what you say after that. You're done. It's sort of like testimony and investment. You can't change your mind. We heard the first thing that's it. Or maybe that's not what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with when we said the person had a proper thought and then an improper thought, talking about two separate times. And then each one had its own law, and it doesn't matter which avodah it was, it becomes possible. And even Reb Meir, according to Reb Meir, that usually says tafas lashon rishon, that we only grab a person's first statement. That would only be by one service, by one avodah by the carbon of the carbon. But if it's two separate services, for example, shchita, he had one thought, kosher, that it was carbon pesach, and by the Kabbalah received the blood, he had a thought that it should be a shlamim. So even Reb Meir that says, oh, you only follow the first thought, but that's only on one avodah I would follow only the first thought. But here, the Kabbalah was clearly possible. He only had one thought by the Kabbalah, and it was possible. And that would invalidate the whole carbon. So basically the question is the Mishnah following Reb Meir or Reb Yossi? And that would determine if the Mishnah is talking about when I have two thoughts, L'shmaya, Shalei is talking about one avodah or two avodah. If it's Reb Yossi, then it could be even one avodah, and if it's Reb Meir, it's two separate avodah. Amri Ahei. Gemara says, which part of the Mishnah are you asking on? If you're talking about the part of the Mishnah where, on the second line of the Mishnah, it says, in the third line of the Mishnah, it says, Shalei l'shmai u'l'shmai pasol. You see that? First part of the Mishnah we itemized it. Shachtu, kibel, halach, v'zarak, shalei l'shmai. You started off proper, and then the third possibility was you started off improper, and then it was proper. It's also possible. So if that's what we're talking about, and Rav Papa's question is like this: when the Mishnah says shaloi l'shmai l'shmai, is that referring to one avodah or two avodas? Bein b'avodah achas, bein b'shtei avodas, bein l'Rav Meir, bein l'Rav Yossi, if salei mikamaisa. That's Rav Papa's question. Reb Yossi, if the first machshava is no good, then Reb Meir would agree that it's possible, because Reb Meir says you grab a person is held accountable for his first thought, and the first thought was no good. So what's Reb Papa's shaila? So whether it's one avodah or two avodas, even according to Reb Meir, it would be invalid. So there's no. Dol Reb Yossi, nami af bigmar davar v'adam nitfas islay. Don't tell me that Reb Yossi holds that the machlekes Reb Meir and Reb Yossi is. Reb Meir says you grab a person's first statement. You hear Reb Yossi? You grab a person's first statement. Reb Meir holds that you grab a person's first statement. Reb Yossi says the second statement. Don't tell me that. Reb Meir says the first statement, but Reb Yossi says both statements. Not only the second one, Reb Yossi says both. So if that's the case, So in this case, it's going to be possible according to both. So that's the shaila. What's the shaila over here? Rav Papa has a shaila if the first statement was possible. We had a machlekes once before, and we're talking about statements here, about thoughts of the validity of this sacrifice, if it's considered if it's a Pesach, or if it's a Shlomim. We had a machlekes Rashi and the Rambam, Rashi and Tosfos, if when there's a psul and a korban because of thought, if that thought means a statement or if it means just a thought. You remember we had this before. The person has to express it or not. If the kohen has to express it. Yeah. Someone told me that I was quoting. That what's the pshat that a kohen has a wrong thought by a korban? Why should he have a wrong thought by the korban? Why did he do that? Because the person, let's say, did an avera and he has to bring a korban. So he shows up at the Beis Hamikdash, and if he didn't properly prepare himself with tshuva and to really regret, to really have the right inspiration and motivation for bringing it, then the kohen can sense that, and subconsciously. And the kohen then comes to him, he says, look, I don't know what you did wrong, but while I was doing the korban, it didn't come out right. So it's not really the kohen's, it has to do with the thought that goes into bringing it. Okay, whatever the case is, here we're discussing which case of the Mishnah is Rav Papa's question attributed to. If it's the case where it's Shaloi Lishmai V'Lishmai, the third case, 1 second, according to Rav Meir and Rav Yossi, would be possible. Ella, rather, let's go to the second part of the Mishnah. Go back one line. Ella al Lishmai V'Shaloi Lishmai. My. Our question is, the korban started off correct. The second thought was not correct. And now the question is it Reb Meir? And the second thought not being correct was talking about a different avodah. The shechita was correct, the Kabbalah was not correct. Or is it Reb Yossi and the shechita itself had thoughts of correct and not correct? And Reb Yossi says, after Gmar Dvar Adam Nitzvas, and it's invalid. Maybe the Mishnah is only Reb Yossi's opinion. Toshima, come in here. Come and listen. HaPesach sheshachtu shaloi l'shmai. V'kibul b'halach v'zarak shaloi l'shmai. We quote the first case of the Mishnah. Our question's on the second case. we quote the first case to prove what the second case is referring to. The Mishnah started off with the korban Pesach was shechted shaloi l'shmai, for the wrong intention. That means it was shechted for a shlomim. Then the Mishnah goes on and says that he received the blood, he walked it, he sprinkled it, shaloi l'shmai. Now, the Mishnah doesn't say in there, or, in Hebrew, oy. Doesn't say that. The Mishnah just says, he shechted it, shaloi l'shmai. He received, he walked, he sprinkled, shaloi l'shmai. Umar says, hey, Chidami, what are we talking about? Yeah, well, let's see, yeah.
Did we learn that all the other karbanos were done before the Pesach korban was brought in to be shechted?
All the other karbanos. You mean of the day?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So all that's being done, all that's being shechted in the whole area now is this is, people say, the Paschal lamb.
Right.
So how is someone getting confused?
Yeah. I don't know how he's getting confused, but he did.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what was going on. Yeah, I don't have even anything to compare it to. But I don't know. Whatever the case is, for however this came about, I don't know how this came about, but his thoughts were Lishma, His thoughts were Shalei Lishma. Shalei Lishma. And we're reading now the Mishnah that we have these different avodas, and each of them was Shalei Lishma. The Gemara says, Hechidam. Inema, if we say Kidiktani, if we read the Mishnah exactly what it says without the Oy, Lamali Adam Machashav Lakulu. So why does the Mishnah go on and say that he shachted Shalei Lishma, and then he was Kibel V'halach V'zarak Shalei Lishma? Why do you have to add that in? Mikamaisif Shalei. It's already puzzle. It was puzzle from the Shechita. Elalav, rather, Hachiktani. It must be the pshat is like this. HaPesach sheshachted Shalei Lishma. The Pesach was shechted Shalei Lishma. Inami shachted Lishma. The Kibel V'halach V'zarak Shalei Lishma. Well, let me give you another option. The Pesach was shechted Lishma. Option number 2 is that the receiving of the blood was Shalei Lishma. Inami, another possibility. Shachtu v'kibel v'halach Lishma. V'zarak Shalei Lishma. Or maybe it was shechted, the blood was received and it was walked all Lishma, but the sprinkling was Shalei Lishma. So in other words, it's really saying options. But when you give those options, how did it become puzzle on a later time? Okay. The Habali Shtei Avodas. Those are cases of Shtei Avodas. Why? Because the Shechita was perfect. Possibly the Kabbalah was perfect. The Halacha was perfect. The problem was the Zrika. And that's where it becomes puzzle. If that's the case, so you give me the options of Lishmai, and Shalei Lishmai comes later. Ema Seifa, let's look at the next case of the Mishnah. Lishmai va Shalei Lishmai. If you started off Lishma, and then you did it Shalei Lishma, Echidami, what's the case? Inema b'shtei avodas haneresha. You already said that it's 2 separate avodas. You just interpreted the first case of the Mishnah that is talking about shtei avodas, where it started off Lishma or Shalei Lishma. So why do you have to repeat it again in the second case? Lishma v'Shalei Lishma. That's exactly, you already itemized it in the first case with all the details. Elalav b'avodah. It must be that the second case of the Mishnah is not separate avodas. The second case of the Mishnah, Lishma v'Shalei Lishma, is talking about in one avodah itself. In the Shechita itself, you started off Lishma, and you finished the Shechita with a thought of Shalei Lishma. But Rabbi Yossi, Damrach B'Gmar Devar V'Adam Nitchas, and now the Mishnah must be Rabbi Yossi. And the reason why it's puzzled is because a person is held accountable for a second thought. Seems to be a good proof. The Gemara says, like, it's not a good proof. Really, the second case is also dealing with 2 avodas. And we said Lishma v'Shalei Lishma. The Reisha, we said that 2 avodas you already said in the Reisha. Gemara explains. Reisha was different. Reisha, the koi b'shchita v'kamachasha b'shchita. Inami koi b'zrika v'kamachasha b'zrika. The Reisha was giving me cases of 2 avodas, but I was talking about where I was by the shechita, I had the thought of Shalei Lishma, or by the zrika, I had a thought of Shalei Lishma, and the shechita was kasha. But what was my thought of Shalei Lishma? I thought that I'm doing the zrika of a carbon. That wasn't this. That wasn't this carbon. Seifa, but what's the case of the seifa? The koi b'shchita v'kachasha b'zrika. I'm doing the shechita, but I'm not thinking about the shechita. I'm thinking about the zrika. Damar harini sheichet as a pesach l'shmayu lizrik damar shalei l'shmay. I'm shechting this carbon pesach to sprinkle the blood of a shlamim. So my thoughts by the shechita was an invalid thought of zrika, of how I'm going to do the zrika in an invalid way. The kamash malan, and now we have a chiddush. The mechashrim me'aveda la'aveda. That I could invalidate a carbon when I'm doing the shechita if I'm thinking about that I'm going to do the zrika in an improper way. Mechashrim me'aveda la'aveda. Now the Gemara says, "V'hainu b'ayder a puppet that you can think during one service regarding another service, and that thought invalidates it. Mechashvin means that it's considered a thought. It's not an action I'm doing, it's an action that I'm going to do, but because that's one of the avodas, that could invalidate the sacrifice as well. Now it says, V'hainu b'ayder Rav Papa, and this is Rav Papa's question. Rashi says, V'hainu b'ayder Rav Papa is that actually in Mesechtes Vachim, Rav Papa has this question of Mechashven me'aveda la'aveda. That's how Rashi learns. But when the Gemara says V'hainu b'ayder Rav Papa, Tosfos over here says, it's a daichik. They say that our Gemara here is quoting V'hainu b'ayder Rav Papa, and that was Rav Papa's question over there. Tosfos says two other pshatim. His first pshat is that the reason why Rav Papa has a question here is our Mishnah talking about that the thoughts are taking place, both valid and invalid, is taking place in one avodah, or is it divided up into two avodas? The reason why Rav Papa has this question here on our Mishnah, and he can't answer it from the fact that we have three cases in the Mishnah, Shachat and Zarak, and then Lishma, Shalei Lishma, and then Shalei Lishma, Lishma, is because I can learn the Mishnah with Mechashven me'aveda la'aveda. I can say that the reason why I have three cases in the Mishnah is because the Mishnah is more complex than just the person thinking about this aveda that he's in. The Mishnah could be talking about where he's doing an aveda and he's thinking about another aveda, and that's why we have three cases in the Mishnah. And now, because I can't bring a proof from our Mishnah that we're dealing with one aveda, because the first case is shtei avedas, second case has to be one avedas. No, because the Mishnah is more complex, because mechashon me'aveda l'aveda, hainu bayin de Rav Papa. That's why Rav Papa really has a good question, and you can't answer it from our Mishnah. This is first shot. The second shot is interesting. He says, "Hainu bayin de Rav Papa," is that you want to know what Rav Papa's real question was? That when he said Rav Papa's real question is when it's talking about one avodah, am I talking about that it was separate times? Shtei avodas would mean by the shchita I had one thought, by the zrika I had another thought. And ba'avodah achas means that by the shchita I thought about the zrika also in an invalid way. So in the avodah of shchita, I thought about the zrika. V'hainu bayin de Rav Papa. That Rav Papa's question is, does a person invalidate a sacrifice in the same avodah when he thinks about another avodah during that avodah? V'hainu bayin de Rav Papa. That Rav Papa's question is more complex than just two separate avodas or one avodah. That the shchita itself, the beginning of the shchita was lishma, the end of the shchita was shalei lishma. But actually, at the shchita itself, I had two machshavas. One was lishma for the shchita, and one was that the zrika is shalei lishma. The hainu bayin de Rav Papa. Yeah.
Doesn't lishma mean you're thinking about the proper thought about what you're doing at that time, right? So right. I think what it's saying is the shayket is worried that Shmendrik down the line isn't going to do the zrika properly. Is that what he's saying?
I think that he's himself is thinking about it. He himself is invalidating. The fact that he's thinking
about it is invalidating things, because now that means
right. I don't know if he's thinking that someone else is going to mess up. I'm not sure. I think it's his thought that he's the one that's doing this. What am I doing? What's my intention here?
So the mere fact that he's thinking about one of the other four,
right,
is problematic.
No, the fact that he's thinking about one of the other four isn't problematic. The fact that he's thinking about doing one of the other four with the wrong intention is problematic.
Which is a problem because people are not paying attention?
It's worse than not paying attention. Here it's clearly, clearly the wrong intention.
I was going to say that.
Okay.
Well, this is an issue if you decide these 4 actions are one mitzvah, one avodah. If these 4 actions are 4 avodas, then it's a different story, isn't it?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to divide that up.
I'm not sure either.
Okay. My question is if they said separate brachas. They said a bracha. They said the Kohen said a bracha when he did each part, when he did each avodah. Lishchet hasazevach. He probably said a bracha when he received the blood as well. The question is, when he says that bracha, does that mean it's a separate mitzvah? Probably not. We say separate brachas on separate actions of the same mitzvah. We say the bracha on the action. So, for example, Sfiras Ha'omer, we say a bracha every night, even though possibly it's one mitzvah. So it gets a little confusing. So let's say there's a mitzvah to bring a korban. Is it a separate mitzvah from the 613? There's a mitzvah to bring the korban, to slaughter the korban. There's a mitzvah to sprinkle the blood. It could be that separate. This goes under separate mitzvahs also. Whatever the case is, even if it's separate mitzvahs, it all needs to come together to make it valid. Okay, Tashma. We're middle of Sama, middle of the page. Tashma, a little under halfway. Tashma, come and listen. We're quoting the third case of the Mishnah. The Mishnah's third case says, or you started with the wrong intention and then you had the correct intention. The Gemara says, Hechidami. So 1 second. You started with the wrong intention, then you had the correct intention, and it's puzzle. What we said before was that Rabbi Yossi says, bigmar. It's not just that it's only bigmar, it's also bigmar. That a person is held accountable for both what he says at the beginning and at the end. So even Rabbi Yossi would say that this is invalid. It's not a kasha on Rabbi Yossi. It's clearly okay with Reb Meir, right? If we're talking about 2 separate avodas, we're talking about that he started off, let's say, by the shchita shalei l'shmai, and then he does the zrika l'shma. Hashta l'shmai v'shalei l'shmai amrit pasal. If you started off with a kosher, you're doing it kosher, and then it becomes pasal later, shalei l'shmai v'l'shma mibai. If you invalidated it right at the beginning, and then you have a proper thought later, how does it come back to being kosher? Why do I need the second case? You started off saying l'shmai, you started off kosher, and then shalei l'shmai. If we're dealing with 2 separate avodas, you invalidated at a later part of the service. If you started invalid, so what, it's going to become kosher later? Elalav b'avodah. It must be that we're dealing with one avodah, and now we have some sort of chiddush. Now, what's the chiddush? The chiddush is, maybe the chiddush is Rabbi Yossi, that Rabbi Yossi holds that it's only bigmar, that the main thing is his second thought. And now we have a chiddush here. We're saying that it's not that here. The chiddush is that Rabbi Yossi also says bigmar, that don't learn Rabbi Yossi to say that a person only holds, that a person's only accountable for his second thought, but not his first thought. Rather, the chiddush is that a person is accountable for both. It would be an interesting chiddush, according to Rabbi Yossi. And since this last case is b'avodah achas, we're talking about, and the chiddush is that a person is held accountable for his first thought also, which is interesting, because Rabbi Yossi says that they're accountable for the second thought. Reishanami b'avodah achas. And the first case of the Mishnah is also b'avodah achas. If the first case of the Mishnah is b'avodah achas, Now our Mishnah is clearly not like Reb Meir. Why? Because the first case said Shalai Lishma Yivalishma. The first case was Lishma v'Shalai Lishma, Lishma v'Shalai Lishma. Reb Meir would say that it's valid. The Mishnah says that it's invalid. So once we've determined that the second case of the Mishnah is Bavei Dachas, that means that the case before that was also Bavei Dachas, and the case before that, Bavei Dachas doesn't fit with Reb Meir. Reb Meir would say that case is. And now we've answered Rav Papa's question. The Gemara says, Loi, it's not a good pshat. Loilam b'shtei Avedis, really we're dealing with two separate Avedis. The truth is, you said, why do you have to say it? You already said that it's possible at the beginning. It's going to become kosher later. Yeah, you're right. We didn't need to say it. But you're right. We were just continuing the possibilities. You started off saying that if it's kosher, and then you have an invalid thought, becomes not valid. So we concluded by saying if it starts invalid, then you have a kosher, it's also not. But you're right. We wouldn't have said this on its own. It's just that this is a conclusion of the. So and we're really talking about two of it. Then, if that's the case, then you don't have a raya. If our Mishnah is Rameir, Rameir could fit with the Mishnah could fit with the Rameir as well. Dr. Stein, what does that have to do with anything?
You can't. The picture was cut off. It says on top, "Please, I'm sorry," and the bottom it says, "I'll take it back," but it didn't come out. Sorry.
Unacceptable.
At least you're looking.
Unacceptable.
Come and listen. Another thought. Another proof. Shachtu shleila eichlav. The person shechts the karban, and he shechted it with the intention that the people that are going to eat this Korban Pesach are people that are not possible to eat it. Why? Because they're sick or elderly and they won't be able to eat it kazayas. Shleilam nuyav. He shechts it with the intention for people that did not sign up to this Korban. Now, you needed to register for the Korban. And if not, you weren't allowed to eat from it. Okay. The next thing is la relam. If he shechted it for people that were not circumcised. Now, why were these people not circumcised? Because their brothers died by the circumcision. They're hemophiliac. The blood didn't clot, so this person had an exception. He doesn't need a bris. Well, but he's still considered an aral. And now he doesn't need to cover Pesach because it says clearly in the Torah that only people that are circumcised, an aral lo yochel bay, someone that's not circumcised. So it's not he's not a sinner, but he still can't eat the korban Pesach. Or for someone that's tamei, pasul. The korban is invalid. The thought of the who's going to be using this korban, which wasn't acceptable, is not invalidates the sacrifice. The Gemara says, here we're clearly dealing with one avodah. The shchita says he had the thoughts by the shchita. Now, umid the seifa b'avaydachas, reishanami b'avaydachas. Now, when we call the seifa, this is actually a Mishnah later on, so we're calling it the seifa. So since that case is talking about one avodah, so here also we're talking about one avodah. The Gemara says, what? Midi area? What are you saying? Is that, it says, Hakadisa, Vakadisa, those are separate discussions. You're proving from something over there that's what we're talking about here. Seifa b'avaydachas, Reisha, that's talking about one avodah, but over here, Iba avaydachas, Ibishti avaydas. Maybe, we don't know, it's a question. Is it one avodah and it's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi? Is it shtei avodas and it's the opinion of Rabbi Meir? It's Papa's question. Tashima, we're going to go further discussing that. La ichlav v'shlei la ichlav. Kasher. The Mishnah said over there in that Mishnah, on the next page, it says that if you had two people in mind, one was someone that could eat the sacrifice, and you also had in mind for someone that can't eat from the sacrifice, would also eat from it. Is it kosher? It says yes, it's kosher. because you had the intention for people that could eat it. Echidami, what's the case? If we're dealing with two avodas, that means by the shchita, I had intention for people that are eligible to eat it. And then by the zrika, I had intention for people that are not eligible to eat it. And we say that it's kosher. Interesting. Why should it be kosher if the zrika wasn't good? The Gemara explains. Taima, what's the reason why it's still kosher, even though the zrika was totally not for the right people? The choshev the zrika, because your thought of who was going to eat from it was by the zrika. The in machshava seichlam the zrika. There's the halacha of having intention of who's going to eat the sacrifice is a halacha that only applies to the shechita. So we're saying, why is it kosher when you have intention for the right people and then for the wrong people? Was because it was two separate avodas, but it's not just the two separate avodas. It's that the intention for the wrong people was by an avodah that didn't matter. Because when it's based on the psukim, that what does it say? That the way that you shecht it should be for the people that are there, but it doesn't apply to the zrika. So why would it be kosher in that case? Because by the zrika it doesn't invalidate it. But if you had both people, the people that are eligible and the people that are not eligible, all by the shchita, kegoin b'shchita, the mahanya be machsheva seichlim, that over there, the thoughts of who's going to eat from it actually make a difference, then it would be possible. The Gemara says, 1 second. But we have the Mishnah, we have another source that says that if there is invalid people in that group, it doesn't make the carbon possible, even if you had the intention, as long as you had intention for correct, eligible people as well. So it's not a din, as we were thinking, that why is it kosher, oichlav, and la'oichlav, shleila that had to do with zrika? That's why it was valid. But if it would all be by the shechita, it would be invalid. It says that's impossible, because even by the shechita it would still be valid. Ella lav, it must be b'avayda achas, that when we said la'oichlav shleila is valid, wasn't because by the zrika, who's coming to eat tonight, this karban, doesn't matter. That's not the reason. The reason is it's valid because la'oichlav is valid even by the shechita. Even by the shechita, that means that the Mishnah is talking about b'avayda achas. I had both thoughts, correct and incorrect. And since that Mishnah is clearly talking about one avodah all by the shechita, so then the beginning of this concept, this discussion, our Mishnah was also b'avayda achas. The Gemara says, we just discussed this. Hakadisa v'hakadisa. Those are separate Mishnayos. This one is talking about two avodas possibly. That's talking about one avodah. Sefer b'avayda achas. Reisha, b'avayda achas, ib'shtei avodas. Could go either way. Reisha, unapproved. Doesn't seem like we answered the question of what's the pshat in our Mishnah. Yibailu. The Gemara has another question. Pesach sheshachta b'shaya meisashana l'shmai b'shalei l'shmai mahu. Okay. What happens is that we said that a carbon Pesach that's shechted, shalei l'shma, is possible. That's only if it's on Erev Pesach. But the interesting thing is that a carbon Pesach the rest of the year, if you take a carbon Pesach, in other words, say after Purim, I decided to designate my carbon Pesach. And then I would go to the Beis Hamikdash and I say, you know what, I want to shech this already. I know it's not Erev Pesach. Okay, well, it's just going to be a shlamim. It's actually valid. If I shecht it before Pesach as a shlamim, it's actually valid. But if I shecht it, it's valid as a shlamim. But if I shecht it as a carbon Pesach the wrong time of the year, then it would be possible. It's not according to Rabbi Yosef. I only had one thought when I brought the carbon. I had a thought of shlamim. I had a thought of shalei l'shmai. So the interesting thing is when I'm going to use now the term shalei l'shmai, I'm actually valid, making the Pesach valid. Because it's not on Erev Pesach, it's actually valid as a shlamim. If I would shecht it as a Pesach, it would be possible. By shechted as a shlamim, it's kosher. In other words, the Pesach the rest of the year is a shlamim. Valid. Yeah, if it's a carbon Pesach the rest of the year, it's possible. No. A carbon Pesach the rest of the year is a shlamim. Pesach is very similar to the shlamim except for the time difference. So look at the question now. They have a question. Pesach sheshachta b'shayim eisashana l'shmai. Vishalei l'shmai. Shechted it for a carbon Pesach, and it's not Erev Pesach, but I also had intention for a shlamim. Mahu, what's the din? Mi yasi shalei l'shmai. Does the shalei l'shmai come along? Umapik le midei l'shmai. And remove it from the fact that you had a thought of l'shma. Umach shalei elai. And does it make it kosher? Because you invalidated it. No, because you actually validated it with invalid thoughts. So does it become kosher? No, you would say, like, 1 second, it should be for sure invalid. You had in mind that it's a carbon Pesach at one moment. You'll see that it's not so simple. You see, you follow through this command. Kiyasir Rav Dimi Amar, when Rav Dimi came, so he said, Amisal Shmaita Kamei Rabbi Yirmiyah. Said, I said this over in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah. We discussed this. Rav Dimi comes to Babel from Eretz Yisrael, and he said that I spoke to Rabbi Yirmiyah about this. And it sounds like this is what I told Rabbi Yirmiyah. Hayel ulashmai machshirei bizmanai. Since, if it's on Erev Pesach, then the thoughts of Lishmai would make it kosher. Ushaloi Lishmai machshirei shaloi bizmanai. And if it's not Erev Pesach, Shaloi Lishmai makes it kosher. Thoughts of it being a shlamim makes it valid. Ma Lishmai machshirei bizmanai. Whereas or just as when it's Lishma, on Erev Pesach, it becomes kosher. Ein maitziyeh midei shaloi Lishmai. But it doesn't, if I had thoughts also of shaloi Lishmai, the Lishma doesn't take over and make it totally kosher. Af shaloi Lishmai hamachshirei b'shaloi bismanei. So too, the thoughts of shaloi Lishmai, which make it valid the rest of the year, ein maitziyeh midei Lishmai apostle. The obvious answer that if it's not Pesach, it needs to be clearly shaloi Lishmai to be kosher. If it is Pesach, it needs to be clearly Lishmai. He says, look, if on Erev Pesach you had thoughts of shaloi Lishmai, it becomes invalid. Even if you had thoughts of Lishma, the Lishma doesn't overcome everything and make it valid. So too, if it's not Erev Pesach, the shaloi Lishmai, which makes it valid, doesn't overcome all the Lishmas that make it invalid. It needs to be 100% the correct way. Which is in other words, the invalid thoughts invalidates it whenever it's, no matter where. And we don't say that, because you had valid thoughts, so that makes it valid. You have healthy germs that overcomes all the unhealthy germs. Naftali, you got the shot? Okay.
I got it.
Okay. V'amar li, so Rabbi Yirmiyah says to Rav Dimi, light, that's not 100%. Im amrit b'shaloi l'shmai shekein naig b'chal azvachim, taimer b'l'shmai shekein naig b'chal azvachim ela pesach b'lvad. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, I get what you're doing, but it's not 100% correct. Because the concept of shaloi l'shmai, the invalid thought, invalidates all sacrifices equally. So therefore, if I have a thought of lishma, and you also have a thought of shaloi lishma, on a regular carbon, that invalid thought invalidates everything. However, by a carbon Pesach, it's a strange story. The invalid thought actually makes it kosher, because thinking that it's a shlamim actually makes it kosher. The fact that you thought, yeah, it's not on Erev Pesach. So I designated it as a carbon Pesach. Now
What's
I'm bringing
Yossi saying? What is Yossi saying?
So that's probably what Rabbi Yirmiyah is saying, is that this sacrifice, the only way that it's going to be possible is if I have thoughts of Lishma. Now, thoughts of Lishma, of keeping in a Korban Pesach, thoughts of Lishma invalidating a sacrifice is so not a strong concept that we never find it anywhere. So we're not going to say that, oh, that's comparable to thoughts of Shaloi Lishma by every other sacrifice. The fact that thoughts of Lishma invalidate a Korban Pesach when it's not an Erev Pesach is too light of a concept to invalidate the sacrifice when I had thoughts that would validate it by having Shalei Lishma. So he says the comparison isn't perfect. Shalei Lishma invalidates sacrifices across the board, and it doesn't, just because you had thoughts of Lishma somewhere doesn't make it valid. But when I have a sacrifice that's going to become invalid because of Lishma, I'm not going to say that that's going to invalidate the sacrifice when I also had thoughts of Shalei Lishma which make it valid. So only when would the Korban Pesach be totally invalid? When I slaughtered it Purim time, that would only be if it was 100% for Korban Pesach. But if I also had thoughts of Shlamim, that would validate. My Haviyallah. So what's the end? What's the conclusion? Amar Rava. Rava says like this: Pesach sheshachta b'shayim eisashana l'shmoi v'shalei l'shma kosher. Rava says it's kosher. It's a very interesting logic. He says the stamai l'shma kai. The default is that it's a Korban Pesach, b'afilu hachi, but nevertheless kishachat le'shalei l'shma, it's kosher. So when I have a default that's a Korban Pesach, which makes it invalid because it's on Purim, it's not on Pesach. You have the default that it's a Korban Pesach. But I combine together with that default Shaloi Lishma, and it makes it kosher. I shecht it for Shlamim. Yeah, trivia. Yeah. Alma, what do we see from that concept? That the default is invalid. But I add in an extra thought of Shaloi Lishma, I add in the thoughts of a Shlamim, and it makes it valid. Alma, I see from that. Asi Shaloi Lishma, Mapik Lidei, Lei Midei Lishma. Thoughts of Shaloi Lishma take it out of its Lishma category. So Kishachet Nami Lishma v'Shaloi Lishma. So when I have thoughts of Lishma and Shaloi Lishma, what's going to be? So Asi Shaloi Lishma, Mapik Midei Lishma. Those thoughts of Shlamim automatically make it not a Korban Pesach. You get what's happening? The thoughts of Shlamim on this Korban Pesach turn it into a Shlamim, and now it's not a Korban Pesach anymore. On Erev Pesach, that's what it did. On Erev Pesach, thoughts of a Shlamim invalidated the whole sacrifice. Why? Because you turned it into a Shlamim, and it wasn't a Shlamim. Okay, so now I shechted on Purim. And I had a thought of a Shlamim. I have a thought of a Korban Pesach, and then I have a thought of a Shlamim. So on Erev Pesach, that would have invalidated the whole thing. It turned it into a Shlamim. So now also it turns it into a Shlamim. And Rava's logic is that because on Purim, when I'm shechting this Korban Pesach, the default is that it's a Korban Pesach. And when I combine with it thoughts of Shlamim, I'm able to make it eligible that it becomes a Shlamim. So now when I have thoughts of Korban Pesach and thoughts of Shlamim, I'm making it eligible by having the thoughts of Shlamim. Amalei Ravada Barava L'Rava. Ravada Barava is a student of Rava, a friend of Rava. He says like this. Dilmashani, maybe it's different. You're comparing the default Korban Pesach, and then you combine with it the Shlamim that it's valid, to where someone actually has both statements. He says it's a Korban Pesach, and he also says it's a Shlamim. That's different than just combining Shlamim with the default Korban Pesach. This is much worse. It says the kosher, because he says, I'll prove it to you. Rava's logic was that when I say that it's a shlamim, and by default it was a Korban Pesach, it becomes kosher. So too, when I say it's a Korban Pesach, and when I say it's a shlamim, it should become kosher. So Rav Ada bar Rava says to him, look, what happens when you have the intention of the people that are eating it? And you have the intention of la'oichla v'shaloi la'oichla. Both people that are eligible and people that aren't eligible, it's kosher. But let's say you only had thoughts of the ineligible people, just the older person or the chayla, that they can't actually eat it. Over there, it's mamish pasel. It's pasel. Why is it pasel? But the default was for the people that were eligible. You must say that. Why is it pasel? Because there's a difference between the default and what you actually pronounce. Over here, you actually pronounced for the eichlav, you made it kosher. But over there, you didn't. So you see, if you pronounce it, it makes a difference than just talking about the default. Amalei, Rava says back to me the area. How can you compare the people that are eligible to join the group to the thoughts of Shlamim and Pesach? You can't compare. Until I have thoughts of a Shlamim, it's considered a Korban Pesach. So the default is clearly a Korban Pesach. You have thoughts of a Shlamim, you make it valid. But over here, do I say that the default people that are registered to this group are the people that are eligible? I can't say that. Maybe these people are going to leave the group and other people are going to come to the group. There's no default people in the group until it's shechted. Until maybe other people are going to come and join the Tanan. People can come in and out of groups until the carbon is actually shechted. So over there is no default. So over there, you have to actually have intention clearly for who, at least for eligible people. But over here, there is a default. The default is that it's a Korban Pesach. Okay, let's leave it over here.